Good evening, everyone. Dr. Randall Gates, board certified chiropractic neurologist, also a chiropractic physician at Gates Brain Health. Tonight, I'm talking about depression and childhood maltreatment or childhood abuse. This is part 2. I already did a talk last week on this. I think in this talk, I have some better graphics and maybe we can go into some more details. I hope that it's helpful. As always, send me your feedback, send me your questions. I really appreciate all the feedback all of you have been sending me. I am going to try and get to those questions in upcoming videos. And yeah, stay tuned. Nonetheless, why are we talking about this? Doing the depression series because according to one article out of the Journal of the American Medical Association, major depressive disorder, which is true clinical depression, is up 3 times from what it was 2 years ago. So not many conditions are 3 times more common, a couple years later. And depression was already quite common depending on the stats of which author you read. Maybe 7 to 16% of the population may have depression at any given time. For those numbers to now be triple is a huge deal. Weekly at Gates Brain Health, we're trying to do our de-stress talk kind of as a group and going over strategies for maybe relieving stress. So I'm trying to talk about this subject for that reason. And good evening to everyone who's joining. Now, I've talked about how genetics relative to B vitamin metabolism can certainly affect one's likelihood of developing depression or having recurrences of depression. I've also talked about the childhood maltreatment or the childhood abuse. And gosh, did I talk about histamines? I don't know if I talked about histamines and depression yet. But there's a whole host of things that I'm going to talk about because depression is multifactorial. Treatment-resistant depression is super common. Unfortunately, it's the world-leading cause of disability. You may think back pain. You may think some sort of joint problem. It's actually depression that's the world-leading cause of disability. And for that reason, I'm talking about all these other factors that may apply to someone, may not, but it may prompt a discussion with your doctor that leads to some new innovative treatment that may be helpful. So, read the disclaimer. None of this is intended as medical advice, and consult with your doctor on anything. These are just ideas. Okay, here's the title of the talk. All right, I'm going to highlight this article first. This is actually a 2021 article. It's very recent. Effects of childhood adversity on the volumes of the amygdala subnuclei. Your amygdala is your fear center, and hippocampal subfields in individuals with major depressive disorder. We'll pause there. So we have our brain model. I always get this backwards because it's reversed. So here's your brain from the side. Our brain, we have a front part called the frontal lobe. We have a sensory area back here called the parietal lobe. As we go farther back, we have the occipital lobe. This is where we see things. Down here, these light green structures are your cerebellum. And then we have down here, the temporal lobe, which is notoriously where we hear things. But the medial temporal lobe, so if we take this brain model like this and we go in here, deep in here is our medial temporal lobe. This is where our memory area is located. This is where our fear center is located. Also, a lot of our emotional processing is in this region. Your fear center sits kind of right in front of the memory area, and the memory area goes deep back in here in the temporal lobe. So I kind of think of the memory area kind of like a tail. It's called the hippocampus. And you can think of the amygdala, the fear center, as like a little grape sitting in front of the hippocampus. Okay? So again, so your brain. We're talking about medial temporal lobe in this discussion. Okay. So for a long time, researchers have known that if you take an individual and you expose them to traumatic childhood events like physical, verbal, sexual abuse, childhood neglect, things of that nature, growing up with parents who have substance abuse problems, that these children's fear center tends to enlarge and the memory area tends to shrink. And we especially see these relationships later in life. We also know that with major depressive disorder, the central physiology of the problem is not per se a chemical issue. The problem is an anatomical relationship between the fear center and the memory area. One can definitely argue there are chemical components. I'm not discounting that it's not a chemical issue, but I'm saying it's not purely a chemical issue. And we know that because when individuals take antidepressants, they don't work right away. Most typically, they oftentimes take 2 to 4 weeks to have an effect. It has now been found that that effect they have is on actually growing back the memory area, the hippocampus. And the physiology of depression, as I mentioned the last few weeks, is an imbalance between, let's say, the fear center and the memory area, where the fear center gets turned on, signals hormonal cascades to your adrenal glands that releases chronically sustained high levels of stress hormones, i.e. cortisol. And the cortisol then, this is your fear center, your memory area starts to literally like wither, starts to shrink for all intents and purposes. The fear center tends to get more dense, gets bigger. We've known this for a long time. Now, as imaging becomes even more sophisticated, as we get more detailed computer algorithms that can quantify densities at a very minute level, we are seeing some different things than what we saw before. So this research article was pretty significant because they found that not only does the memory area shrink, again, remember the memory area is deep down in here, not only does the memory area shrink, but also the right side of the amygdala shrinks too in those with depression and a history of childhood trauma. Why might that be? We don't really know. We do know that there is laterality, meaning there's a sidedness, and for example, your left memory area deals more with like verbal memory. Your right memory area, right hippocampus, deals more with spatial memory. And it might be a relationship involving, faces or something of that nature, which you can imagine. And I talked about it last week in the childhood trauma broadcast, how they see certain parts of the brain get hyperconnected in those with a history of physical abuse, particularly involving facial recognition. So it makes sense if a child is seeing someone doing something really bad, they're seeing that facial recognition, then that may have an impact on one side of the brain versus another. So these researchers found, and this is basically a detailed diagram of the hippocampus and portions of the amygdala, they found that, again, both sides of the memory area were atrophied or shrunk, and the right side, certain areas of the fear center were decreased in volume as well. So one thing we always have to realize is that I'm trying to bring kind of generalities, clinical tidbits that may be helpful for those suffering with these issues. Also, there are a lot of details and nuances the more we learn. And oftentimes, as the brain gets overexcited, that can actually lead to a shriveling of neurological tissue. A great example of that is that for those who have depression, this is the medial surface of the brain. So it's as though we took the brain and we're looking at the medial surface. This structure here is called the corpus callosum. It's the connecting fiber tract of both of your hemispheres. It allows your left hemisphere to talk to your right hemisphere. The main principal tract that's doing that. Now, surrounding the corpus callosum, this area of orange, that's called your cingulate gyrus. Your cingulate gyrus is a principal area of what we refer to as the limbic system. What we know is that those who have depression have atrophy or shrinkage in this what we call corpus callosum, meaning below the corpus callosum, subcallosal cingulate gyrus. So researchers have known for quite some time that this area is actually collectively referred to as the SAD area. And in those who have depression, this area atrophies. And it's thought to be that there are so many sad emotions that this area literally overexcites itself. And if you overexcite neurons, then they tend to shrink. Neurons are kind of like oatmeal. You want just enough stimulation. You don't want a lack of stimulation, and you don't want too much stimulation. You just want the right amount of stimulation. So hopefully that provides some, maybe some framework for things going on. Okay, let's hide that. Let's see here. Let's go through this. So childhood trauma has been linked to major depressive disorder. As I mentioned, changes in epigenetics is a possible reason why stress results in symptoms of depression. What are epigenetics? We have our genes, and then how our environment interacts with our genes changes the way genes are expressed, how proteins are produced, and that's called epigenetics. For example, there's also the element of how environment interacts with your genes. So I did the broadcast on folic acid in depression, which is called MTHFR. Those with an MTHFR polymorphism and a history of childhood trauma are much more likely to relapse into depression than someone without both of those features. And if you have just one of those features, then the risk of relapsing is not as great as having both of those features. So how your life corresponds with your genetic predisposition oftentimes results in what happens in terms of something like depression, or if you relapse or not. Also, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, I'm going to do a whole talk on that. Researchers have found that if you have an abnormality in that gene and you have a history of childhood trauma, well, then that can lead to more depression and less density in the memory area. So that's the kind of the overlapping effect of genetics and nature, or excuse me, nurture. So the overlapping of genetics and environment. Okay, stress has been proven to be linked to changes in stress response genes, neurotransmission, neurotrophin genes. Studies have found that chronic stress results in changes in the BDNF gene, which I just mentioned. One study found that modifications of the serotonin system and glucocorticoid system are present in individuals with stress linked to depression. Okay. This is a really nice diagram as well from this article. You can pause the video and look up the authors from Neuroscience Biobehavior Revolutions, I believe, in 2019. They show how changes in the physiology of brain behavior combined with environmental stressors, combined with the epigenetic changes, lead to alterations in gene expression, and that may be part of one's depressive symptoms. So again, we can look at how the effect of childhood trauma has an impact on the brain, that by itself. And then you throw in maybe a methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, which is B9 metabolism simply, or a BDNF polymorphism. And those can interplay with each other to then result in why maybe somebody's not responding to an antidepressant. And maybe they need some supplementation with active folic acid. Maybe they need to talk with a psychotherapist about their trauma and really dig into that and have that adequately dealt with or assessed. So, yeah, perspective. And then there's one more down here I really like. This is a really cool graph. So on what we may perceive as the x-axis, you can see childhood trauma questionnaire. So in essence, if someone has more history of childhood trauma, you're going to see more dots farther over to the right. On the y-axis, we're going to say this is density of the hippocampus. What they found, the memory area, what they found is that the more childhood trauma someone has, as you can see this line going down, the more trauma they have, the less dense their hippocampus is. So this was combining questionnaires with MRI scans, and these are different MRI scans. These are MRIs that look at density. It's a specific type of computer program the MRI images are run through compared to 3,000 people the same age to come up with how dense, kind of like a standardized test in school, how dense each area of the brain is. Here they're looking at the hippocampus. So I think this is a pretty interesting finding and something that's kind of an interesting takeaway. Okay, I'm trying to bring this into the screen. Okay, so kind of in summary, studies have found that reduced hippocampal volume, specifically gray matter, are present in children who are victims of childhood trauma. Reduced hippocampal volumes have been linked to major depressive disorder in and of itself. So that's part of the physiology of depression, which allows the escape of cortisol to then feed back to the brain and damage neurons there. We know that antidepressants, at least the antidepressants that have been used up until the last 5 years primarily, and now there's some newer generation ones, but antidepressants largely grow new brain tissue in your memory area, which then opposes the fear response, the fear center, leading to reduction in cortisol, allows for the brain to heal. And we think that's a central component of why antidepressants work. The hippocampal structure, your memory area, is highly influenced by genetics and environmental stressors. So if you're responding to an antidepressant, great. If you're not responding to an antidepressant, that's the whole reason for me doing this series, is for you to have more ideas or conversations to discuss with your doctor of, hey, can we do a genetic test? Can we test my MTHFR polymorphisms? Can we test my ability to break down stress hormones, called the COMT enzyme? Can we test my BDNF gene function? Because BDNF gene abnormalities respond really well to exercise. So what happens when people are depressed? They oftentimes don't have enough energy to exercise. So that can kind of feed on itself. So the hippocampal structure is highly influenced by genetics and environmental stressors. The hippocampus displays neuroplasticity, and changes in hippocampal volume can put one at risk for depression. So in essence, what that statement is saying is that your hippocampus is one of two areas in your brain that grow new brain tissue all the time, or new brain cells. Most of your brain, when you're an adult, it's fixed. You have as many neurons as you're going to have. As you developed, you pruned back different neurons, you grew different neurons, but your brain is pretty well fixed, except in the memory area and the smell area, your olfactory bulb. So that neuroplasticity can be a good thing or a bad thing. And what we want to do, particularly in those who have depression or major depressive disorder, is clinicians typically are trying to encourage neurogenesis, positive neuroplasticity changes in that area, because that is one thing we know that seems to help those with depression. So that is tonight's talk. Future topics on depression are going to revolve around hormones. I am going to do a talk on gluten. I'm going to do a talk more in detail, just in general, on B vitamins. I probably will bring in the COMT enzyme, and I will do a talk on BDNF. So let me know your thoughts. I hope, again, this was helpful. I hope you all have a wonderful Thursday night, and I will see you soon.